Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 247, Big Finish.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello there, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready for a big finish today?
Oh, I'm definitely ready for a big finish. I'm standing on the diving board. I've got my flip-flops on, my snorkel, my goggles. I just hope the crowd applauds.
Fantastic. Well, we're finished, so you can go home. That's fine.
Okay, good. Where's the sunblock? Wait a minute.
Well, we're looking forward to sharing this interview with you, with Jonathan Barnes and Nicholas Briggs. We really had a wonderful time speaking with the two of them. And what we may do for our Patreon supporters, if you're good to us, and you are, we will release the video version of this interview after a little editing magic as a special release. So there is still time. If you're not a Patreon supporter of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, just get over to patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock, or just click that Patreon link in the show notes that are available here on whatever platform you're listening to us on, and support the show. $1 a month, $3 a month, $5, $10, whatever works for you. We do have some thank you gifts at the higher end that we send out, just as a little incentive, as a way to show our appreciation. And we are building towards more transcripts. We're looking to go through the episodes from this year, get all of these transcripts up and running, thanks to your generosity. And fortunately, I think we have a little bit to go through some of our back catalog as well, so stay tuned for that. And of course, support our sponsors as they are here. We'll hear their sponsorship spots throughout the show. If you frequent them, tell them that you heard about them through I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. It helps them and it helps the show. Well, today we are very pleased to be joined by two personalities from Big Finish Productions. Now, Big Finish is a production company, a publisher, and a distributor. They produce CDs and downloads and books, and they're probably best known for their Doctor Who series of full-cast audio dramas and spin-offs, but they also produce a wide range of other series, including, of course, Sherlock Holmes. And Jonathan Barnes is a writer, and he's been contributing regularly to the Big Finish Sherlock Holmes range since 2012, beginning with The Adventure of the Perfidious Mariner, and penning over 20 hours of stories since then. Jonathan is a lifelong Holmes fan, and his journalism has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, the literary review, and the critic. As J.S. Barnes, his most recent novels are Dracula's Child and The City of Dr. Moreau. Nicholas Briggs is an English actor, writer, director, sound designer, and composer. He's associated with the BBC science fiction television series Doctor Who and its spin-offs, particularly as the voice of the Daleks and the Cybermen in the 21st Century series. He's also the executive producer of Big Finish Productions, where he's produced, directed, and written several audio plays, as well as acting in many of them. Outside the realm of science fiction, Briggs has appeared on stage at Nottingham's Theatre Royal since 1997, including a run as Sherlock Holmes in Holmes and the Ripper by Brian Clemens and The Hound of the Baskervilles, adapted by Briggs himself. And we're about to speak with him about his portrayal as Sherlock Holmes in the latest Big Finish production. Nick and Jonathan, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Well, hello.
Hello.
I thought you were going to say something else.
No. Well, I'll say something else, but I'll leave the first hello to you. So why don't we begin the way we begin with all of our guests? And Jonathan, we'll start with you. How did you first meet Sherlock Holmes?
Right. How did I first meet Sherlock Holmes? Yes. Well, this is something I've said elsewhere before, really. And I wish I had a more kind of, intellectual looking story for this. But I don't know. I met Holmes originally through Basil the Great Mouse Detective, that very underrated Disney film. It came out, I worked this out, I think I was 7, something like that. Saw it at the cinema. Went home, wanted to read more. My dad had the complete short stories on his shelf, and I remember him saying to me, "You do realize these won't be about the mouse, don't you?" And I said, "Obviously," because I was a very precocious child. Started reading the short stories, pretty much, literally, I think, started with A Scandal in Bohemia and went forwards from there. Not getting all of it, obviously, but loving what I did understand. And yeah, that was the start of my kind of love affair, I guess, with Holmes.
It's a valiant and heroic start, no question. Nick, what about you?
I've got a couple of theories, but I'm not quite sure, because it's like one of those things that you feel you've always known about, like Doctor Who, which is, my other great passion. A while ago, I attended an event quite a few years ago now, an event in the Houses of Parliament where the Sherlock Holmes Society of Britain, or I may be getting the name wrong, had a big gala dinner to which I somehow got invited just to sit down and eat, not to do anything significant. And Stephen Moffat was making a speech, who I know Stephen very well, and he was extremely entertaining. But when he talked about how he got to know about Sherlock Holmes, it suddenly struck me. I don't know whether it's because I just thought it was a good answer, but I thought, I think that might be the same for me. And bizarrely, it was either through seeing the movie with Robert Stevens in, Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, and sort of, which is bizarre because, of course, it's an odd, scandalous take on Holmes and not the traditional thing. Or it might have been Murder by Decree with Christopher Plummer and James Mason as Holmes and Watson, but it was certainly through a film that I became aware. And then I remember I started to notice that there were Sherlock Holmes seasons on BBC One, and they'd have the Basil Rathbone films. I love the way he said Watson with a slight American tinge on the Watson, and then I suppose I was always on the lookout. There was something about it that really appealed to me, and not least because there are, and it's a scandalous thing to say, I know, great similarities between Sherlock Holmes and the Doctor in Doctor Who, in that I think a lot of Doctor Who writers have consciously or otherwise stolen from Sherlock Holmes with the otherness of the character of the Doctor, the person who seems to stand outside normal earthly emotional concerns and has an intellect above and beyond everyone else's. I think that is as I say, unconsciously or not, a direct steal from Sherlock Holmes, and that the audience. So for the audience of Doctor Who, they were already kind of familiar because everyone, as I say, kind of knows about Sherlock Holmes anyway, whether they know how they do or not. So yes, but I only really started reading the stories when I needed to do so for work reasons, so for adapting and for other people adapting, which, you know, I felt, yeah, when I have time, I shall go back and read more. But I always feel like a little bit of an imposter because I realize what it's like. This is a very long answer and I'll shut up very soon. I realize what it's like when I've interviewed lots of Doctor Who celebrities over the years. And when you go to interview them, they get very nervous because they feel like it's an exam and they might get the answers wrong. And you know what I mean? They get very nervy and they feel like, don't ask me about Doctor Who. And I say, no, it's not about gauging how much you know about Doctor Who. And I did a speech presentation, whatever it was, to a Sherlock Holmes society of one form or another in London once. And I said this, you know, they insisted I did a presentation as opposed to an interview, which I preferred doing, even though obviously it feels now like I'm doing a presentation. I said to them, you know, this is how I worried about tonight. I said, so it isn't an exam, is it? There aren't going to be any questions. And they all just stared at me. And I thought, and then I said, there are going to be questions. It is an exam. I got myself intimidated but through their lack of answer to that question.
Well, then how, Stephen, did you because you've played Holmes, you know, obviously.
Yes, Nick, not Stephen.
Nick, sorry. I've got Moffat on the brain, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I introduced him into the conversation.
Yeah, but
that's a known disease, by the way, Bert. Moffat
on the brain. Yeah, well, I have resonance where my brains ought to be. But you played Holmes, you know,
yes,
on stage and obviously audio. So what was the path for you to get over, you know, your sense of the character and actually bring the character to life?
The first time I played Holmes was for there was a fringe production in London at a theatre under a pub called the Drayton Court Theatre, I think it was called. And a friend of mine, Ken Bentley, who's since worked for Big Finish doing a lot of directing, asked me, he wasn't a friend then, he was a friend of a friend, and he asked me to play Sherlock Holmes in the play by Conan Doyle, that's of the Speckled Band. Is it called The Stoner Case, the play? Is that right?
Yeah. Well remembered. Yeah,
I think. And so he was doing it with a lot of recent graduates from a particular drama school. I can't remember which. And a friend of his said, you know, he said, I need someone, you know, with a bit more experience to come and be a proper Sherlock Holmes. And he said, you want my mate Nick Briggs? He'll be brilliant at it, and he loves Sherlock Holmes and he loves that kind of stuff. And so he got me in to do it, and I think that's when I read the short story as well. And from there, I always had it in mind, you know, to find other ways of playing Sherlock Holmes, and then I got to play it in some other theatre stuff. And then it was through doing the Holmes and the Ripper adaptation, the Holmes and the Ripper play written by Brian Clemens. I met Brian. He came to see the show, bless him, because his son Sam was in it. I think that was a condition of him letting the producer have the rights to give his son a job. That's not even a joke. That is the truth. I think the producer, Colin McIntyre, the late great Colin McIntyre, asked for a discount, and he said, all right, if you give Sam a job. He's just stopped working for the RSC and he needs a job. And after one of the performances, I spoke to Brian about the rights, and he said, yeah. And I said, well, obviously my people will speak to your people. We go, no, that's it. The deal's done. He said, you know, he said, it's all cream off the top now. He said, you know, I've earned my money from this. And he was very matter of fact about it. And so we got it going pretty quickly. And then that sort of gave me the idea that we could maybe do some more. So I got other writers on board. And it wasn't until I made a connection with Jonathan when Jonathan, tell them about how we met.
About how we met. What, the first time or the second time?
Well, the first
around?
time and how it relates to the second time.
Well, yeah, I mean, I came in just after all of this had happened, didn't I? I came into starting to do bits and bobs of work for Big Finish after this, including the great big fantastic sounding dinner at the Houses of Parliament, which I must have missed by a matter of months, but there we go. I'll let it go. No, I've sort of told this story before, such not really a story even, is it? No, I came along to Big Finish Day to speak to come along to the day, which is like a sort of convention, we should say, isn't it, for fans of Big Finish Productions, people that like all of their audio dramas. But I had met Nick some years before in, as Doyle would say, the old century, the 20th century, at a convention, science fiction convention. I'm from Norfolk, which is fairly sort of a little bit isolated and windswept, and there was particularly isolated and windswept science fiction convention up by the coast. I'm never quite sure how much of this Nick remembers, or whether I've sort of subtly implanted a false memory into his head. It was up by the coast somewhere. It was an old holiday camp, wasn't it? It was a holiday camp. It was profoundly sinister, wasn't it? Unintentionally.
Yes.
I was still in school, so it would have been 90. I was in the sixth form, 95, 96, something like that.
He's much younger than me. Yeah.
I am.
All right.
Well, yeah, that's that. I would not that much younger, actually, if you think about the ages, how old you would have been at the time, I think. And I went along, and at the time Nick was involved in doing sort of science fiction videos, sometimes with a hint of crime as well, often starring sort of Doctor Who alumni. And I was a big fan of these, and have made my family sit through multiple editions of this. And I always wanted to be a writer, and Nick had written a lot of these dramas, including one in particular. I always remember the Air Zone Solution, very good, strong script. And I came along, and as a sort of, kind of slightly stereotypically, certainly quite sort of, socially maladroit teenager, and said, I really want to be a writer. I love your scripts. Can you give me some advice? And Nick's advice has not really stayed with me, but what did stay with me was actually how, and I realized later on as well, was actually how kind Nick was, because you must have spent 20 minutes with me, 25 minutes with me chatting. And I always remember that. And I did then go away and went to university, and I always wanted to be a writer. And I published a couple of novels with actually, for what it's worth, quite a sort of Doylean quality, particularly the first one, The Somnambulist, that was published 2005, I think. And I published these and had sort of a little slither of success. And I thought I'd love to do some audio. Went along to Big Finish Day. Nick was there, pretty much besieged, I think, by people, but I did get a couple of minutes with you and just said, big fan, love what you're doing at Big Finish. I'd love to be a part of it. This is who I am. We've met before, and these are the novels that I've published. And you sort of professional, but backed away a little bit, I think.
Yes.
Made sure there was a table between us, and you could see the security staff.
But until you gave me the books, and I took them. And then later on, I saw that they had, I think, New York Times reviews on them or something. I thought, oh, hold on a sec. So I started reading The Somnambulist and thought, oh, this guy's the real deal.
Oh, that's very kind. But then, you took them away, and you saw that I was perhaps a good fit for Big Finish. And then we went from there, didn't we?
Well, there was the centenary of the Titanic coming up, and I said, I want Big Finish to do something about that. And it seems to me that you have the right sensibility to write. So I said, pitch me anything you like about the Titanic. It'll just be a one-off thing. And he pitched a Sherlock Holmes story called The Perfidious Mariner. He said, how about Sherlock Holmes? You do that. And that's how it's done. And that was so brilliant. He shamelessly pitched other Sherlock Holmes stories at the recording. And from then on, we just sort of thought, he's really good at this. So let's just get him to write them. And that's how it stuck. Because every time he pitches something else, just on the tail end, So I had to disappoint a lot of other writers that were sort of in the wings waiting to write Sherlock Holmes stories. And I thought, well, look at him wincing. And in that old cliche, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I thought this is working really well. And we feel really confident about what Jonathan does. So that's why we've continued with him.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And of course, we should note that Big Finish began its Sherlock Holmes productions with David Stuart Davies works. Of course, there was the Roger Llewellyn play, two plays that
Yes.
David turned out for him: Sherlock Holmes: The Last Act and Sherlock Holmes: The Death and Life. And then one of David's pieces there, The Tangled Skein. So wonderful material from which to pull. And there were 4 original Conan Doyle stories that Big Finish produced as well. You want to talk about those a little bit, Nick?
Well, yeah, we did The Hound of the Baskervilles and the Final Problem. And the
Empty House.
Empty House and the Speckled Band.
Speckled Band, yes. That was, yes, the Speckled Band. We did one morning in the office. It was a very quiet office, but it turned out we did it as a little freebie, but it turned out rather well, actually. And then, I mean, The Hound of the Baskervilles is a proper full-blooded full cast drama adaptation by Richard Dinnick. And the others are more or less just the text of the short stories, but with the with the voices, the character voices done by various different actors. But it's still, I think, mostly they have the he said he and what have you in them as well. Not all of them. Some of them have been slightly adapted, but they're completely faithful representations. Yes.
So, Jonathan, I want to go back to you and understand how you get your inspiration for all of these wonderful and different stories, these different settings in which we find Holmes and Watson. Where do you draw your inspiration from?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, the only real answer is Doyle, isn't it? Who is the great genius, really, under whose shadow we labour. I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, what Nick was saying about the Holmes they did at the start of the range, which were kind of a mixture of adaptations and of various sorts, really, and the stage play and the novel and so on. I mean, I remember, I think my pitch to you, Nick, very early on was to say, okay, well, why doesn't Big Finish do with Sherlock Holmes what it does with Doctor Who? So you don't do new versions of old Doctor Who stories. You find the gaps in Doctor Who, of which there are many, many gaps, of course, and you tell those stories in the gaps, and often it's made sense of things on screen that haven't made sense for 30 years and more. And I thought, well, let's do the same with Holmes, because I mean, Hound of the Baskervilles is great, and Big Finish's version is great, but there are so many other versions out there of that story and of all the others, really. Let's sort of go into the gaps, and that's where Doyle comes in. I mean, there is this sense, I think, and I don't know how where you guys stand on this, really, but this the claim that it was always a very sort of minor creation to him, and he thought his spiritualist work would go on, and his great historical novels, The White Company, all of that. I don't know. I always feel that he's protesting a bit too much with that, really, because there's so much love in those stories and so much strangeness as well, and they're full of gaps. They're absolutely full of gaps, and there is this sense, I think, I've written sequels to other stories as well, a similar case of Dracula. There is this sense that he's almost reaching out a hand and saying to the many hundreds and thousands of people who've come in the years since, and saying, let's fill in this gap. Look at this story, see the possibilities that are here. Where are all the little links in the chain? Because so often in those stories, I've said this before, it's as though he's giving us these men's lives in negative. We see some of the cases, but there's all this stuff going on underneath. So really, I'm just sort of going in a way and finding these extra links in the chain and sort of excavating what's there. I mean, someone like Watson's personal life, for example, is hinted at in the stories and is provided fuel for scholars, of course, for decades. How Many Wives of Dr. Watson and all of that. We've got a wonderful Dr. Watson in Richard Earle, and I've given him all this emotional stuff to play, and I'm sure Nick would agree. He's absolutely hit it for six, I think, hasn't he? Every
and
time.
Richard is lovely. Richard and I have a great sort of working relationship, and we don't live near each other. We don't hardly ever speak, but every now and again when we go to do Sherlock Holmes, I contact him or he contacts me, and then we spend 3 hours on the phone or on Zoom or whatever talking. So we have a great warmth for each other, you know, and he is kind of Dr. Watson, Richard. I mean, I cast him in the first place because I was thinking of all the actors I'd worked with, and I just thought, I think Richard Earley has that sort of quality, that earnestness, you know, the thing that he has that that Watson doesn't have is a really what's the word? Slightly self-deprecating and self-harming sense of humor. You know, he is merciless about himself and has, you know, and sometimes you don't quite realize what he's said, and it takes me a couple of seconds to process, and then I'm on the floor laughing my head off. He's such a, and he does such a brilliant job. He has a fascinating voice, I think, and the two of us work so well together. I really love it. Sorry, I'm dinging. I should have turned my notifications off.
And while Nick turns his notifications off, it's our turn to notify you that here's a word from our sponsor.
Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 22 novels. The one he thought his best is an adventure story of knights and chivalry. 20-year-old Alan Edrickson travels the world encountering bullies, con artists, thieves, a damsel in distress, and two men who become his closest friends. Together they join the White Company, archers and fighters led by the gallant Sir Nigel Loring. Will our hero win the hand of Loring's romantic daughter Maud? Will the chivalrous Prince Edward restore Peter of Castile to his Spanish throne? Published in 1891 and never out of print, The White Company is a tale of pageantry and piracy, heraldry and hope, published now in an exclusive annotated edition with the original N.C. Wyeth illustrations in blazing color. Don't you owe it to yourself to read Conan Doyle's favorite book? Get the annotated White Company at wessexpress.com.
You mentioned this wonderful working relationship you have together, and I think that's so important, particularly with icons like Holmes and Watson, who themselves are, very close working associates as well as friends. Talk to us a little bit about how the recording process has worked for you over the last 2.5 years or so with the pandemic, when you may not be able to be in the studio together. How do you actually record and cut your parts? Is it an active, like a video call, or are you recording them separately? How does that all work?
Well, we use a system called Clean Feed. When the pandemic came, I had for many years been hosting the Big Finish podcast with my co-host Benji Clifford, and we did it talking on Zoom and recording locally, and then I would edit the two bits together, sync them up and edit them together. And so initially I said, listen, guys, we can carry on with all of Big Finish. We'll do it this way. And we started doing it with Zoom. But the problem with Zoom is, even though we're hearing each other okay at the moment, it's not brilliant quality. And so it's difficult for the director to sort of pick up all the nuances of how the lines are being delivered. So I looked around all the available systems, and Clean Feed seemed like the best one, the best user interface. And that means you can have multiple people online being recorded centrally on Clean Feed servers, but we also have people record locally. So it's the belt and braces thing. So we get two versions of each separate recording of all the actors. So we're still able to record together and react off each other. So it just becomes like a huge studio that embraces the entire, in this case of this production, the entire country. Sometimes with Doctor Who, it's encompassed the entire world. We have people in different countries, people getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning in Australia to record, So yeah, we did it through Clean Feed, and then it all gets edited together. And as you can see here, I've got some good sound insulation behind me and all around me here. So that's what people did. They turned their houses and sheds and outside lavatories into studios.
Well, we love clean feed. We actually use it for
I saw
many
you
of our own
nodding
recordings.
enthusiastically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of our guests have a little bit of technical difficulty getting connected and all, but we're fans of it and we understand the audio quality. So glad to hear that.
Yes.
Yeah. Jonathan, you mentioned earlier Conan Doyle's thinking about his own work. One of the things he always complained about was how difficult it was for him to come up with plots, and you've come up with some remarkable plots in the series of adventures you've written. What's your thinking about all that, and what's your thinking about, as a writer, the wonderful thing about the Holmes stories is they sort of always begin usually with this moment of some sort of performance by Holmes. There's a quiet scene in Baker Street and Holmes comes up with a series of deductions, in the first few minutes that astonish Watson or whoever's there. What's your thinking about all those mechanics, the Holmesian demonstrations, the difficulties of coming up with plots?
Yeah, I mean, the demonstrations are very difficult to write.
Very difficult to speak as well. I would just say that Ken Bentley, the director, always pushes me to do them faster. He said, "You're thinking too much. Holmes is so clever, he doesn't have to think." That's, by the way, sorry to interrupt for a moment, that's, by the way, the brilliant thing about playing Sherlock Holmes. It reminds me of, almost what Tom Baker says about playing the Doctor. It's great to play a character who is so incredibly clever, because of course I'm nowhere near as clever as that. But to put yourself into the mindset of someone who sees the world in a different way, who sees the clues dancing around in front of me when other people just look at it and see mundanity. But and the way he's like an arrow, I often think he's a sharp edge, and Watson is the shock absorber around him to sort of prevent him slicing into the world too harmfully. Sorry, Jonathan, back to you.
No, that's very true. I mean, it's speed, isn't it? It's so often the key, I think,
yes,
to Holmes, because he's all. I think Peter Cushing said something similar when he played Holmes, that he wanted to bring a sort of the energy of a greyhound or something to it.
Brilliant.
That you've got that speed all the time, and then he will just stop. He will absolutely stop, won't he? And all that speed is gone, and he will spend days, in sort of some sort of melancholic state.
Well, he's bipolar, isn't he? He goes hyper, and then
it's hard to think he wouldn't now have that sort of diagnosis, perhaps, or maybe something else. I don't know. That's a can of worms, I guess, isn't it?
Yes.
But no, the demonstrations are hard to write, and I mean, Doyle did say that it was difficult. He also famously write one before in a morning before going to play golf in the afternoon. I can't remember which one.
He wrote them at cricket matches. He wrote them on the railway. I mean, whenever the inspiration struck him, he had his notebook with him and he scribbled it out.
I'm a great one myself, not for Holmes, obviously. I'm not qualified to write it, but I write on the go. And quite often I pass landmarks or places in London where I think, oh, that's why I wrote the bit where the Doctor climbed up with that, and I remember places by the things I wrote when I was there.
That's great. So, Jonathan, you previously, wrote books. Talk to us a little bit about adapting your style and your writing specifically for an audio audience.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a different. It's a very different medium. I mean, I absolutely love writing audio. I think, I mean, the most obvious challenge is that it's just dialogue. With the Holmeses, of course, I cheat quite a lot because partly because not just because of laziness, but partly because I want that Watsonian voice in there. And so often in any sort of movie adaptation, TV adaptation, you take Watson's voice out of it, and it really alters the whole dynamic. I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think you watch Holmes on screen, and quite often he comes across as unlikable, or he comes across as very strange or distant. And the stories are full of Watson softening him, aren't they? And saying, he didn't love women, but he was always incredibly courteous to them. He could put people at their ease. He had these flashes of humanity and softness and all of that. So I wanted to retain that when we did these Holmes adaptations. And I think, probably in the past I've gone overboard in giving Richard great big swathes of stuff to do. And there's been whole afternoons, I think, when Nick's just gone. And
I know it's
Richard's
quite nice. I
still
think
being there. Yeah.
I'm playing the lead character, but I don't have to do all the heavy lifting. I just turn up for the exciting bits, and Richard has got all that responsibility. It's a great deal.
But yeah, I mean, just using speech and sound effects is difficult. And with the Holmeses, as I say, I do use the narration to give us a bit of that other texture. Otherwise, I mean, goodness me, Nick has written hundreds of hours of audio drama. And with the Doctor Who's, for example, I mean, the aim, I think, is very much to have a kind of soundtrack. This could be like a soundtrack off the television. And you've got to avoid those classic traps of, why are you pointing a gun at me? Put it down.
Yeah.
Is there a bomb in that suitcase, and all of that sort of expositional dialogue, which is really hard to do. You have to find other ways around it, but it's useful, and it's interesting, I think, because you are kind of knowingly limiting your palette as a writer, and that sort of restriction often creates interesting effects. Sometimes just bad dialogue, but hopefully interesting effects.
Well, in the cases of Holmes, and you see this in other media, London and the environs are frequently essentially a character. And you have that in The Hound of the Baskervilles, where the Moor and Dartmoor, is a character. So how do you approach that, Jonathan? I mean, it seems like a very magical thing that you're able to do here, to use this toolkit, these characters, to create interesting new plots and put them in places where they haven't been, and to fill in the gaps. I don't want to say what's the process, but what's your thinking about making it live from an audio standpoint?
I mean, there's sort of two things up there. I mean, from the audio standpoint, we should say it's part of a fantastic team who come back again and again and again. I mean, the sound designers at Big Finish, and I know actually it's been Benji, hasn't it, Nick, who's done the last couple of these. Yeah. And Jamie Robertson has written the music pretty much for all of them, I think. And I'm very aware that I'm handing over a template. I'm an architect handing over the sort of, the architectural plans for the building, and the team are going to build it. So much of you're right, that presence of London, or wherever I send them, if they're in the countryside, all of that is conjured out by the sound design. And as Ken Bentley would tell you if he were here, my stage directions are very skimpy often. I will just say kind of windswept moor, or, busy London street, because, I know that I'm putting it in the hands of people who are brilliant, much more knowledgeable than me about all of that stuff. And the wonderful music as well, I think adds to that sort of background sense. So that's the technical stuff. I mean, in terms of the actual stories, I tend to think, let's find the gaps. And I've written a lot of stories in the sort of gaps in the canon. We did a very young Holmes, as Nick will remember a few years ago. We've done Holmes at the end of his life. The last three stories that we've done, Master of Blackstone Grange, Seamstress of Peckham Rye, Fiends of New York City, are always in that really interesting period, turn of the century, 1900, 1901. Holmes not far off retirement, because we know he retires, doesn't he, not long after probably The Adventure of the Creeping Man. And then Watson's also seemed to have picked up a new wife from somewhere, Doyle tells us. Holmes says I was abandoned by Watson for a wife at this point. So I've really sort of dug down into that sort of other underexplored area, and found these men kind of in middle age, trying to sort of reestablish themselves in the world. Those are the gaps. Often, though, you asked earlier where I start. I often start not with the puzzle, but with the emotional beats. And it's often Watson and it's often Holmes, and ideally both of them together, having some sort of emotional kind of, don't want to sound too Hollywood, some sort of emotional journey or growth throughout the story. And once you've got that's your sort of bedrock, and then you add the puzzles and the mysteries on top.
Well, before we get too far afield, let's pause here a moment and listen to a clip from Sherlock Holmes, The Fiends of New York City.
From Big Finish Productions, Sherlock Holmes, The Fiends of New York City.
You do have a case then, or at least the glimmerings of one?
Perhaps.
Certainly not more than an hour ago, I received a communication of a decidedly curious kind. The message came from an American gentleman who sports the rather splendid name of Ephraim Gill.
The truth is so grisly that I hardly know where best to begin.
He means to call upon me imminently and to engage me, he says, upon a certain matter which has to do with the nature of evil itself.
A wretched and savage business, don't you think? A dreadful and an infamous crime.
Her throat had been cut from side to side, and her face had been painted white all over.
That poor woman. The work of a devil.
Give it up, man! Worse even than that, Doctor. As we three sit here jawing and swapping theories, that fiend has settled into an apartment on Baker Street, just a short walk along the way.
Order! I will have order!
Would the Prime Minister agree with me that this nation stands at present upon a point of crisis when it comes to all matters concerned with crime?
There is some evil in that building, some treachery, which I do not at present understand.
Sherlock, there is evil everywhere. Such is the nature of the world. But what I have to say to you might affect the very soul of our nation.
I want a piece of information.
I fear that I must upon this occasion, and with regret, decline your invitation.
There you make the same mistake as so many others have before you.
And what mistake might that be?
To believe that I am offering you a choice.
Big Finish, for the love of stories.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, there's one more question I really need to ask you on behalf of our listeners. In the Big Finish pantheon, will Sherlock Holmes and Doctor Who ever meet?
Well, there is a story, isn't there? That I forget the name of now.
You've done it. You've done it.
Yeah, I know. We've
done it.
Yeah.
All-Consuming Fire, it's called, isn't it?
Based on Andrew Lane's novel, Doctor Who novel. Yeah. So it meets the Seventh Doctor, Sylvester McCoy. So yeah, go to bigfinish.com and type All-Consuming Fire into the search pane at the top, and you'll find it. It was great fun to do that.
We'll have a link directly to that production in our show notes for our listeners. So make sure you check that out. Speaking of connections between Doctor Who and Sherlock Holmes, Nick, I would imagine you are aware that Tom Baker has inhabited both roles.
Indeed.
And I wonder if you'd seen his BBC production, his BBC portrayal as Sherlock Holmes.
Yes. Tom and I have discussed Sherlock Holmes a lot over the years, and he always says, yes, that's a part I failed in twice. Because he also played it on stage, where in a tour, and I think he did, I think he went around Ireland or something, because he said, this is a terrible anecdote to tell actually, but he said there's a bit where it's Holmes and Moriarty are like the same character in it. So there was a switch between the two all the time. And he said at one point when he was on stage doing something, he said he heard someone in the audience saying, is it himself or himself? That's one of Tom's anecdotes. Don't blame me. But yeah, I mean, I don't think, I haven't gone back and watched the Hound of the Baskervilles that Tom did for the BBC, but I remember being quite disappointed about it at the time. And I don't think Tom is a great champion of it from what I've already told you. But I wouldn't go as far to say as I agree with his assessment, because that would just be rude. But I remember somehow Tom stripped out all the essential Tomness when he played the part. You know, he thought, I'm not going to do it like that. And it was so subdued. And I think that the thing that's so appealing about Sherlock Holmes for me is as a character with real angles. He fires off in different directions so suddenly and so directly. I love that energy. You know, I'm sorry, I'm getting into it as I'm speaking. You know, I just adore that. But it's a part you have to really do your homework on, because you know, I remember when when I did the first performance of Holmes and the Ripper on stage at the Theatre Royal Nottingham, it was weekly reps, so I'd only had 4.5 days to rehearse. And by the time I got to the second, I got through the first performance on adrenaline, but when I got to the second night, I didn't quite have the energy, and there were several points where I just couldn't maintain the energy, and I almost fell over several times because I was so cross with myself. I get through something and I just go, you just think, this is not working. If I do it slowly, it doesn't work. It needs to fire out like a precision dart. So I got carried away.
Yeah, no, that's great. But look, I think there's an interesting kind of difference between Holmes and Watson. I mean, we've often remarked that Watson is everyman. Watson is an imprint of who we are as we read the Sherlock Holmes stories or watch or listen to the Sherlock Holmes stories through Watson's eyes, through Watson's experience. So when you think about portraying Holmes, how much do you have to think of the audience? How much do you have to think of yourself that you bring to the character and kind of, break the glass, as it were, to make sure you're reaching those people?
Well, to answer it a different way, one of the things I love about doing this is because, as Jonathan mentions, I'm the executive producer at Big Finish, the creative director. So I'm responsible for all the creative output. I have a lot of admin to do, a lot of producer, a lot of grown-up boring stuff. And the brilliant thing about this is that I can come along and largely, unless something pops into my head and say, or can I just say as executive producer, and everyone goes, I can largely get rid of all those responsibilities for myself and just focus on the parts and indulge myself in that fantasy and convince myself that I am the cleverest person in the world and be very direct and imagine that I can see things in a way that no other human being can. So it's the way I approach playing any part, even the Daleks, even, they're very direct. They always just want to kill people or do bad stuff. There's a similarity in all my acting that I want to immerse myself in the extremities of the role, the extremeness of the role. Not quite the same thing, I guess. So I hope that my training and ability as an actor and experience as an actor takes care of how it communicates to the audience, but I'm in the moment and I'm believing it until we finish the scene, and then my behavior is appalling and Richard and I laugh outrageously about stuff, don't we, Jonathan? I think when you build up such a head of steam, it's inevitable, when you finish and the steam blows off, as it were. And also, one of the loveliest things about it is that Holmes is adored by Watson. And I fool myself that I'm adored by Richard Earle. He soon persuades me otherwise after the recording. But so I feel in a very safe space. So I feel that I can really throw myself into it.
Well, I think it shows, certainly, in the productions. And hey, just by way of suggestion, maybe an outtakes reel would be something the fans would really enjoy.
I think there have been some in some contexts on the extras. The trouble is, it just makes us all sound completely incompetent.
We don't want to pull the veil back entirely.
Yeah, we don't want the truth to get out.
Well, Nicholas Briggs, Jonathan Barnes, thank you so much for joining us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. The latest production of Big Finish is Sherlock Holmes, The Fiends of New York City. You can find it on bigfinish.com. Of course, we have links to that in the show notes. But again, thank you both for being here. Well, that was a lot of fun.
Well, it's fabulous, and the work that Big Finish has done, the audiobooks, the collections, there's so much to talk about when you talk about both Doctor Who and Sherlock Holmes, because both continue forever. Both are always bringing in new generations when they discover the characters. But also there's so many untold stories for both. And if you go to the Big Finish website, bigfinish.com, you can see all of the audiobooks, that have brought back actors like Tom Baker and others, and Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy, and give you these new adventures. And it's the same sort of thing that's going on for Sherlock Holmes. And it's wonderful. And the quality, in general, of British audio work, but in particular the Big Finish materials, is just fabulous. The sound design.
Yeah, I think that's akin to what we talked about in episode 245 with Charlie about Moriarty on Audible. This high production level really, and we saw this too with or heard it as well with Bert Coules in the BBC radio series. It's more than just a reading. It's more than just a script or reading a story. This sound design, the atmospheric setting, it really helps to place you in the action and to feel the emotions of the characters a lot more deeply than you would simply because you're immersed in it. So I think Big Finish does a really, really marvelous job with it. The MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories is the world's largest collection of new traditional Sherlock Holmes stories, with all author royalties going to the Undershaw School for Children with Learning Disabilities. And as of the end of June 2022, these authors have raised over $100,000 for Undershaw. That donation, which continues to rise, has been gifted from the royalties of all of the stories coming from the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories. The deep partnership between Undershaw and MX Publishing has spanned a number of years and has witnessed many changes. Undershaw, of course, was the house built for Arthur Conan Doyle in order to accommodate his wife's health requirements, and it's where he lived with his family from 1897 to 1907. While he was there, he would have worked on The Return of Sherlock Holmes and The Hound of the Baskervilles. And that continues now with the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, now up to part 23, under the capable editorial guide of David Markham. Congratulations to our friends at MX Publishing on reaching the $100,000 mark in their support of Undershaw. As you continue to show interest in the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, MX Publishing will continue to be able to support Undershaw and all that it offers, those beacons of the future. Check out the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories at mxpublishing.com. It's everybody's favorite quiz show in the Sherlockian world. That's right, it's Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we ask you to use your ratiocinative deductive abilities to determine which Sherlock Holmes story we are in fact talking about. Now, if you were with us here in the last episode, episode 246, you'll recall that we gave you this clue. Losing 2 secretaries might put you off your feed, but lose the 3rd? That's carelessness indeed. Bert, can you tell us which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about?
Oh, of course I can. That's one of the espionage cases. That's the story about the spy who hid secrets in candies that were the size of a belly button. That's the case Watson called The Adventure of the Naval Sweetie.
No, I'm sorry. On behalf of all of our listeners, I'm terribly, terribly sorry. That's not what we were looking for. We're going to turn to our friend Eric Deckers, who's always good at helping out in these conundra. He says, I've got it. The story of the murder of Willoughby Smith is called The Adventure of Willoughby damned. Willoughby damned. That's pretty good, Eric. No, he says, wait, that's not it. It's the man with the golden pince-nez. No, that's not it either. The actual name is The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. Yes, that is correct, Eric. The golden pince-nez is what we were looking for. And lots of other people knew that we were looking for the golden pince-nez as well. So why don't we turn to our friend, the big prize wheel, and give it a big spin. And we'll see who the lucky winner is this time around. Okay, landing on number, my goodness, 44. It's one of the highest that we've had yet. And let's see, number 44 looks like it corresponds to Madeline Quinones. Madeline, congratulations. Good to hear your name here again. Keep being a guesser, a participant. That's how you win, folks. Everybody who submits a correct entry has an opportunity to win. So, and we do this completely randomly. So there are names that come up again and again. We can't apologize for that. We can only thank you for participating. So thank you, Madeline. And what do we have as a prize for Madeline? What did we promise the last time around, Bert?
I think it was a new Bentley.
No, you know what it was? Our friend Ross Davies from the British Empire promised was a registration packet to our listeners. And Madeline actually wrote in, interestingly enough, and thanked us for doing this show because she said she hadn't been able to attend in person, and this was the next best thing, having your wonderful descriptions, Bert, and your capturing of the sound of some of the presentations and of the presenters as well.
Oh, that's very gratifying. Thank you, Madeline.
Yeah. Well, we will get that prize off to you, Madeline, so stay tuned. And I guess that means it's time for another of our canonical couplets. So let's get into it. To Switzerland, then Germany, then Montpellier, the swarthy workers' cudgel rescued Watson from the fray. If you know Let's try this again. If you know the story we are looking for here, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. And I suppose we would do well to once again dive into the wonderful coffers of the IHOSE vault. We have a lot of things to choose from now, thanks to our friend Tony Katroki, who has been donating items to the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere prize vault. So thank you for that, Tony. And it will be a mystery prize, keeping in the spirit of a Sherlockian podcast. Well, Bert, we seem to have really done just about as much damage as we can around here. I suppose we'll leave folks to hear the damage we do on our other show, on Trifles. If you haven't started listening to that yet, there are now almost 6 complete seasons. We are rounding the corner on 300 episodes on Trifles. So check that out wherever you get podcasts. Just look for Sherlock Holmes Trifles and join us there for a weekly discussion of some of the more, well, trifling issues in the Sherlock Holmes stories. In the meantime, I am the non-trifling Scott Monty.
And I'm the generally and completely unserious Bert Wolder.
And together we say, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.